Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to make a start on the GMade GOM. The manual starts off with lots of text. The left hand side is all in Korean, but I'd guess it's saying the same as the caution list on the right. It's the usual stuff: don't run the truck in a busy road, don't stick appendages in rotating parts, the same stuff that pretty much every manual starts with. They also talk about the tools and radio gear you're going to need. There's the box spanner, grease and shock oil that the kit comes with, and the next few pages have diagrams of all the parts, which is very useful if ever we need to get some spares. Okay, here we are then at step 1, and it's straight in with gears and bearings. Very nice. I like it when kits start with something interesting rather than just attaching some plastic plates with a couple of screws. It doesn't mention which bag to open first, but after checking it does appear that we'd start, as you'd expect, at bag A. It's still worth checking all the bags though, as with some kits the bag labels have no relation to the build steps. There's quite a bit of stuff in this one, so before we get building we need to organise all the parts. Unfortunately, quite a few of the plastic parts have already come away from the parts trees, leaving some rather sharp nubs where they were attached, so we'll have to trim those as we go. Another thing we should get ready: in the unmarked bag with the lights there's a bag of metal balls. I don't think we're going to need any in this particular video, but I want to get them ready so I remember that they're there. They'll end up replacing all the plastic balls on the parts trees. Interestingly, there's absolutely no mention of them in the instructions. I can only assume the plastic ones weren't really good enough in the long run. Right, let's get to the actual build. First we need to collect up the parts. For the plastics there's the axle housings. It'll need to be carefully cut from the parts tree. For best results, a set of cutters with a flat on the side work best. If they're fairly good ones you won't have to do any trimming. Next is the pinion housing. This one was already loose in the bag, but it does have that rather sharp nub where it broke free, so we need to trim that so it's nice and smooth. There is of course 2 axles to build, but we're just going to build one in the video and look at the differences between front and back when we get to them. From the metal parts bag we need the small gears. The quality feels fairly good, like the kit metal you get from some of the Tamiya kits. Not a high-end hardened steel by any means, but it should do the job just the same. Next on the list are the shafts that the pinions fit to. They're in the same bag as the axle shafts. Now for the screws bag, and rather than try and find some E-clips with it all still in the bag, it's going to be much easier to pour the whole lot into a plastic pot. Auntie's steam pudding pots work rather well. We can make life a bit easier by moving all the long screws over to yet another pot, just so it's not quite so full, so we can see all the small fixings easier. From the pots we need 2 E-clips and 8 M3x10s. It's worth noting, like all good kits these days, the parts diagrams down the left of the page are all actual size. It makes it really easy to identify your parts. For the bearings we need 2 of the large skinny ones and 2 of the smallest ones. There are 2 that are very similar. The 5x11x4 we have here, and there's a 6x12x4, which if you're not careful would be quite easy to mix up. We're going to start with the input shaft, and on one end there's a flat that slides into the pinion gears. To keep it in place we need to fit an E-clip. Easier said than done in this case. The slot on the shaft for the clip is below the level of the pinion. It's ever so slightly recessed. Being very careful, it's doable with some pliers. These ones have a fairly wide end, but they've been ground down to make the tip a little bit thinner, which does help. The main thing is not to ping the clip off and lose it. If you're worried, the standard trick is to put your hands in a clear plastic bag when you fit the clip. That way, if it does ping off, it can't get very far. On the back of the pinion, we need to fit one of the large bearings. It's a tight fit, and if you don't press it on straight, it will get hung up. It should slide on without any real effort at all. Next the shaft and the bearing get pressed into the cover plate. This time the bearings are very tight fit. You can gently press it into position and very slightly wobble the shaft to persuade it. We don't want to wobble the shaft too much though, as it's not great for the bearings. A little bit of wobbling isn't going to hurt though. On the other side the smaller bearing goes in. This one should slide in without any real issue, as the shaft should already be nicely aligned. Now the shaft and plate are complete, we can fit the assembly to the axle case. If the bearings and shaft are properly aligned, you'll probably find the shaft's going to drop out as soon as you turn the plate over. Don't worry though, we can pop it back in later. The plate gets attached with 4 of the M3x10s. Now, the holes in the plastic do make them rather tight to thread in. It's not a bad thing, but it does mean there's a fair amount of friction. So when you're screwing them in, you need to take it easy, as it would be ever so easy to generate enough heat to soften the plastic, ruining the thread. The easiest thing to do is do up the screw a turn or two, then move on to the next. Do that one up a bit, and so on. What you really want to avoid is using an electric driver. It can be tempting, but it makes it far too easy to overheat things. When all the screws are in and nicely seated, we can pop the input shaft back in. Rinse and repeat, and we've got a pair of axles with step 1 complete. Step 2 now, and building the diffs. I'm not sure if you can build them as anything other than a lock diff though. I don't think GMade make a set of internal gears for an open diff. Okay, this time we need the crown gears, the gaskets, which is a little odd as there's nothing to seal in or out, some of the big bearings, 8 M2x8s, the 2 metal diff lockers, and the plastic diff cases. To assemble, first we need to drop the diff locker into the diff case. The locker has 2 tabs that need to line up with some slots. Next we can pop one of the gaskets onto the crown gear. The gasket has 4 notches that line up with the holes. It's not a perfect fit, but you can kind of prod it with something like a small Allen key until the screw holes are nice and clear. Put the diff case up to the gear and line up the holes, being very careful not to disturb the gasket. Install 4 of the screws, going a bit at a time so as not to let the plastic heat up, just like we did before. This is also a good spot to employ the cross pattern tightening scheme. We can go top left, bottom right, bottom left. The idea being it'll pull the 2 parts together as evenly as possible, which will give us the best chance of it all coming out nice and straight. That just leaves the bearings. They simply press on, 1 on each end. One thing for sure, differentials are so much easier to build when there's no actual differential. And of course we're going to need 2 of them, so here's the second. Right, step 3, which appears to be fitting the diffs to the axles. For the screws we're going to need 8 M2x8s and 8 M3x8s. We'll also need 2 of the bearing caps per axle. Now GMade do a nice looking set of aluminium ones, but I can't really see any major advantage to them. There's also the metal diff covers, but I've got something in mind for those, so we'll deal with them in a minute. Right, first we drop the diff into the axle. Due to the shape of the moulding, it's only going to go in one way. And the bearings have nice slots to guide them into position. It's all very nicely done. Next the caps go on, so they just fit over the bearings and get 2 of the M3x8s each. As I'm sure you can guess now, we need to tighten up the screws a bit at a time to avoid building up any heat, and to make sure that they're evenly tightened. When the caps are in place, we can grease up the gears. The grease comes in a little pot rather than a tube, so we need to use a cocktail stick to apply it. A nice coat over the crown gear will do. It'll spread itself around quite quickly once we get the truck up and running. Next would be fitting the diff covers, but first we're going to give them a lick of paint. To make sure the paint's going to stick, we'll need to clean up the surface. It feels like there's some sort of oxidization on the surface, so we need to give it a quick rub down with the plastic scourer, making sure we get into all the nooks and crannies. Then, just to be completely sure, we can give it a wipe down with some IPA to clean up any remaining grease. Right, the first coat will be some grey primer to give the paint something to stick to, followed by some blue paint. This is the same colour we painted the Grand Hauler. When that's nice and dry, we can give it a couple of coats of lacquer just to give it a bit of extra protection. Okay, when that's completely dry, it's best to leave it a day or so to be sure, we can fit one of them to the axle with the M2x8s. This time you have to be a little bit extra careful that we don't scrape the paint. I'm sure it's going to get scratched up once the truck's running, but it would be nice to keep them nice and shiny during the build. And that, of course, is one axle. We just need the second. Step 4, fitting the truss. Okay, we're going to need the trusses, of course. Now, they're a nice chunky bit of reinforced plastic, and like the bearing caps, you can get GMade aluminium ones, but the plastic really does feel like it's not going to break anytime soon. For the screws, there's 4 M3x8s, 2 M3x8 countersunk, and 2 M3x12 countersunk. Fitting the trusses is really easy. The truss is such a good fit, it's going to stay put even without the screws. You don't have to try and hold it in position while you fit them. The outer 2 holes get the regular M3x8 cap heads, and the inner 2 get the countersunk. The only thing to watch out for is that you get the long and short ones the right way round. The shorter countersunk screws go on the longer side of the axle. If you look at the design, it's shorter to clean a crown gear on the inside. Okay, once those screws are done up and we build up the second axle, that's going to be it for this week. It seems like a good place to stop because from here the two axles become front and rear. So far I'm rather impressed by the fit and finish of the parts. It's all had that Tamiya-like perfect fit when it goes together. Very nice. Anyway, that's it from me this week. I'm not sure what we've got next week. There's a couple of things in the pipe, so we should be able to keep up this alternate GOM build and other videos thing. As always, thanks for watching. If you like the video, do please hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment if you've got something to say. Bye guys!